Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. Join us as we hear from prominent figures who have played pivotal roles as lawyers, negotiators, and diplomats in the quest for peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. This is the third episode in our special mini-series in which we focus on ongoing developments in Syria. Today, I'm honored to welcome back PILPG's Senior Peace Fellow, Betsy Popken. Betsy is currently the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley School of Law, and during her time with PILPG, she advised parties involved in the Syrian, Darfur, and Yemen peace processes. For a number of years, Betsy served as the chief legal advisor to the Syrian opposition delegation to the Geneva peace talks. During that time, she was closely involved in championing the role of women during the negotiations, working in particular with the Syrian Women's Advisory Board. I recommend to our listeners to have a listen to Betsy's previous episode, where she provides a glimpse into the challenging process of negotiating peace and leading a negotiating team, and offers important insight into the critical roles played by women in the peace process. Today, we'll draw upon Betsy's deep familiarity with the Syrian context and delve into her reflections on what is happening in Syria today and what she expects for the future. Betsy, thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, Betsy, let's jump right in. It's now been well over a month since the overthrow of the Assad regime. You've been closely following recent events and the hopes and concerns of our friends and former colleagues in Syria. What is your understanding of the sentiment in Syria today?
Thanks, Paul. So I'm going to start out by saying just yesterday, I spoke with a member of the former Syrian opposition negotiating delegation who returned from a long trip in Syria. And I've spoken with a number of Syrians over the last month or so and done my own kind of research and reading. So my observations today will be based on kind of all of that, those conversations and the reading. I will say there's still a euphoric sense among many Syrians, just so happy that the Assad regime is finally gone. That includes both Bashar as well as his dad, Hafez. There's just a sense of they're free finally from their dictatorships. That being said, there's a growing sense of the need to address some of the biggest challenges on the ground that people address every single day. And two that I heard recently, one is the economy. I heard this from a Syrian who was living in Syria just before the regime fell, defected, or living in Syria just before the regime started firing on innocent protesters. He defected from the Syrian government. He said this is the first time he's returned to Syria, and he can see a huge change in terms of people's ability to afford groceries, travel in their cars because gas is so expensive. So I'd say the economy is one that's impacting everyday people, and one that, as lawyers, we don't talk about quite as much. Another one is infrastructure. Power is constantly out throughout different parts of Syria, and that's something that impacts people every single day. So those are two kind of big picture issues that affect people every day that I think will need to be addressed. That being said, people are still very happy, but with the understanding that some of these big picture issues need to be addressed and need to be addressed soon. And those two are just scratching the surface.
Well, Betsy, let's pick up on something that you and I worked quite a bit on during the Geneva negotiations, and that is the diverse array of Syria's constituencies. It's a highly eclectic, or the population of Syria is highly eclectic in terms of their various identities. What are some of the most pressing challenges and the key opportunities in establishing a transitional government and laying the foundation for long term democracy that represents all of the Syrians equitably and fairly.
Hmm. I will say right now, the leadership of Hayat Tahrir Sham is the body appointing people to interim government positions. So right now, it's kind of limited to one kind of core constituency. That being said, they are saying all the right things about inclusion of Alawites and inclusion of Druze and inclusion of women, though to my knowledge, they've only appointed one woman to the role of the kind of office of women. So I'd say they're saying the right things. What we need to see is actual steps to make sure those things happen. And I think one key area where that can happen is the national dialogue process. That was supposed to start early this month. It was postponed until, to my knowledge, an indefinite period of time, but I think they're hoping for sometime next month. And, that process is, I understand, is likely to lead to some discussion of either revisions to or drafting of a new constitution. And my understanding is that that process is supposed to include Syrians based on their geographic location in Syria, which would also kind of add to the diversity. So I think the national dialogue is one area where they can really take advantage of putting in voices from across the different perspectives in Syria. I think another area is political parties. That's something that Syrians have not really had the advantage of in the past. And, I don't know what steps are currently underway by HTS to create regulations surrounding those, but I do know of at least one political party that's already kind of getting set up and operating. So that's another area where different perspectives throughout Syria can be represented in the future. I will say, just a note of caution, that while HTS is saying the right things, at a local level, there have been a few incidents that I know of, retribution against former regime representatives. So, I read a story just a few days ago about a conscripted soldier being killed by his neighbors. And, so there are incidents like that happening kind of on a local community level that need to be addressed in the short term.
Well, in terms of addressing the complexities that are facing the Syrian population and the interim government, you've worked very closely during your time with PLPG, advising the Syrian opposition coalition to the Geneva negotiations, with the opposition and also with civil society and with women's groups. Can you share with us a little bit what you learned from the ability or learned about the ability of the Syrians to collaborate across these various identities and constituencies? And what role do you envision for nascent civil society in Syria in the
Mhm.
upcoming arrangements to transition to a democratic Syria?
So I will say, in any democracy, there are conflicts between people of opposing views. So that is, even, you know, assuming Syria sets itself on the path to a democratic state, there will be disagreements. That being said, I hope that, given everyone's hope for a better future, that people will be more keen to cooperate with one another. In terms of, roles that civil society can be playing right now, I think it's going to be a while before we have kind of a set kind of accountability and transitional justice process. But in the meantime, as I mentioned earlier, things are happening on the ground locally. I do think that's an area where civil society could step in local communities to help kind of bring communities together, and reconcile communities, because the Assad regime for decades, Assad's regime, two of them, for decades divided Syrians between one another. And so among some, there's a really strong desire for retribution. And I think that's a role that civil society can play on the ground, in addition to the role that they've played throughout the revolution in kind of their local communities and outside of Syria, creating kind of draft plans for what can happen in the future.
Well, Betsy, I want to pick up on something you've mentioned twice now, which is transitional justice and accountability. And as you and I know from working in the context in Libya and Yemen and elsewhere, if there isn't a mechanism for transitional justice with a large dollop of accountability, there will oftentimes be local retribution. The civilians will take justice into their own hands. But it's exceedingly difficult to build these mechanisms for accountability and for truth and for transitional justice. So, what are you suggesting or recommending to your Syrian colleagues when your phone rings and they ask you about transitional justice and accountability?
Yeah. I think it's ultimately for Syrians to decide. As I mentioned earlier, Syrian civil society groups and others, including kind of the Syrian opposition negotiators and Syrian opposition bodies that we worked with at PILPG, m- have discussed this issue extensively and created, multiple roadmaps of how accountability and reconciliation could be achieved in Syria. I don't know what the process is they're gonna be putting in place. My guess is is something that could be addressed at the national dialogue coming up, which will include a cross-section of society where they can talk about, is this, I guess I should say HTS has already said they only intend to hold kind of those at the decision-making level accountable. And so, how do they want to address accountability? Is it through a hybrid tribunal? Is it through domestic courts? Is it at the international level? I think that's something that the Syrians themselves need to talk about and decide, being guided by all of the kind of detailed plans that have been put out so far. I know PILPG worked with civil society groups to create a plan for a hybrid tribunal. So I think that's something Syrians need to decide. I will note that recently a viral video spread of the current interim justice minister in Syria for ordering the execution of two women by gun who were accused of prostitution. And there's a video of him in it. And so that's caused kind of a bit of an uproar in terms of, is that the rule of law that we want for the future of Syria? So I do think there need to be steps taken to lay out kind of a future process that really addresses, the root causes of the atrocities, but also starts to bring together, again, those Syrians who have been pitted against one another for decades to prevent things like what I mentioned earlier, neighbors ganging up and killing a conscripted soldier.
Betsy, let's step back from Syria a little bit and look at the broader Arab Spring transition, both its successes and its failures. And one of your strengths as the lawyer for the opposition delegation during the Geneva negotiations was comparative state practice. What's happened in other ceasefires, what's happened in other peace negotiations or transitions. Um, Apply that skill set here for us and our listeners. What are some of the lessons that you're sharing with your Syrian colleagues and friends from the other successful or failed Arab Spring transitions?
Yeah, I would advise them not to follow the direction of the other Arab Spring transitions. I think, not only is Syria a unique country of its own, but I do think they can learn from certain failures in terms of, some of the issues that came up in the constitution drafting process in Egypt, some of the failures that came up in the national dialogue process in Yemen. There were really meaningful processes put in place that just didn't work out. And so I would urge them to, continue looking at these kind of past examples of how things have worked, but use them especially use the Arab Spring ones as an opportunity to learn what didn't work and take steps to avoid that.
So, Betsy, you seem very hopeful about Syria's future, cautiously hopeful. What is it that gives you hope about Syria's future, despite the immense challenges that they're facing?
I think the Syrian people are very hopeful and very happy. And I do think that, with some exceptions, people they're really desiring a more inclusive society than what they had. And so I think it's really that kind of that instinct of if many people are wanting a more inclusive society, can those people be in leadership roles or decision making roles where their viewpoints are able to make a difference? And that's what gives me the most hope. And that they've been waiting so long for this. And they have created so many plans for how this can work out. And they've worked with Syrian advisors, they've worked with international advisors to create these plans. And I do think if they can take advantage of the work that's already been done and set their sights on creating something collectively that addresses all segments of society's needs, I'm hopeful.
So, Betsy, you've been very generous with your time. So, just one last question, and that is, what is the question you wished I had asked you, but I haven't?
So I guess the question I wish you would have asked is, to what extent are actors who have been involved in setting all of these plans engaged in kind of the current interim governing structure in Syria? And what does that mean, or what should change? And I will say, you know, while I know that two members of kind of the Syrian opposition body outside of Syria have met with HTS leadership, that for the most part, they are not involved, both kind of at the civil society level as well as at the political opposition level. And that's not to say, I don't know what HTS has been doing in the background, but I do think it would be a great advantage to current leadership to take advantage of all that's been done and all of the insight that, folks throughout Syria and those who were displaced by the war, in part because they had to defect, the work that they've done, as well as international experts. And I know that HTS is in touch with some international experts, but I do think there's a lot of groundwork that's already been done that, I hope they can benefit from.
Betsy, thank you for taking your time today to share with us your thoughts and insights on this rapidly developing transition in Syria, and what you see and hope for in terms of the future. I know that your assistance during the peace negotiations in Geneva was invaluable for the Syrian opposition, and so it warms my heart to know that you're in deep contact with our friends and former colleagues that are engaged in trying to help transition Syria onto a peaceful democratic path. So, thank you for taking your time today to have this conversation with myself and our listeners, and thank you again for all of the amazing work that you do around the globe, and in particular in Syria on the peace process.
Thank you, Paul. It was good speaking with you.